for trainers, collectives, and individuals that were looking for a program to follow that was chud-free, or perhaps one that came directly from us. There is Liberation Martial Arts Online. Thanks to Joseph Roca, Revolutionaries Garden, and Kwame X for signing up. If you want to sign up for Liberation Martial Arts Online or want to increase your financial support for the Southpaw Project, you can find special tiers on our Patreon. If you'd like to listen to all of our shows without any breaks or interruptions, you can also find uncut versions of our shows also on Patreon. This is Sam.
And this is Southpaw.
This episode was sponsored by Chad Loader, SH, M. Shelton, Berkshire People's Gym, and New Guy. On this Southpaw, we have our friends from the Neighborhood Martial Arts Project. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Now let's start with introductions. Let's start with you, Myles. Can you introduce yourself and give us some background on how you got into martial arts, radical politics, and how those things ended up combining into this project?
Yeah, definitely. So, I've been into martial arts since I was a little kid, kind of, influenced by my dad. He kind of, got some of the early UFCs on tape. I was like fascinated by the jujitsu after I saw that. There was really nothing around me. So I did, traditional martial arts up until I was a teenager. I did a style called Shorin-ryu. It's a pretty hard kind of direct line style. We did a lot of hard sparring, which was a little unusual for traditional martial arts at the time. And so, yeah, but throughout that period, I was always interested in grappling, wrestling, jujitsu. And so finally, when I got to college, there was a jujitsu club, just like, I think one day a week. But I really instantly fell in love from the first time. And I had, heel hooked my brother a bunch when I was a kid, looking up all the, the instructionals. But, actually getting into learning some technique and stuff, I was hooked from that point. I started training in Philadelphia, after college, and I've been training for about, I'd say since, that was 2009-ish. So I've been training since about then. I got my black belt in 2019, the beginning of 2019. In terms of my politics, I've always, kind of similarly, my parents were both, left liberals. And so I've always kind of been, interested in left politics, but just very politically naive. I would say sometime, maybe a little bit before the rise of Trump, I just, I was living in the suburbs, through conversations online and just reading and studying kind of started to shift to the left. Over that period, I moved to Philadelphia, did get involved in some organizing. I was with the DSA for a little while, Lilac, which is a group that kind of broke off from DSA, done some organizing there. I've also been involved in, the bail fund and some other kind of campaigns like that. I was just saying to Sam before the recording, I cannot remember how I first got involved with the original project that birthed Neighborhood Martial Arts Project. But, basically it was 2 blocks away from my house. And, in my experience with jujitsu, so from the time I was a little kid, the instructor that, of my original karate school was a prison guard, basically. And so from my and I'd always been kind of had left instincts, I would say. And so from the time I was really young, I always had kind of separated in my head, okay, I go to these right wing spaces to learn martial arts, and then I have my, political ideas that are separate. And so seeing that there was a leftist martial arts space, I just, reached out and got in touch with them, and, it was pretty early on in the project. And so, that's how I kind of got involved in that. And then through that period, for the first year or two, I think of being involved, I was still teaching at the old jujitsu school I had taught at. or that I had went to before, still training here and there. And then really like kind of the uprisings in 2020 were just kind of like a breaking point for me where I just like decided, I just can't like in good conscience and as, a leftist be teaching cops how to hurt people more effectively. And, we also need to kind of, build our own spaces for the people that most need to learn martial arts. So yeah, that's kind of how the two married for me.
And Jelani, one of the OG squad members of Southpaw and now OG member of NMAP. Tell us about yourself and your journey to NMAP, or Neighborhood Martial Arts Project.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm definitely, I'm actually kind of like the newbie, for the Neighborhood Martial Arts Project. Both, Myles and, Alejandro, Chef Alejandro, who wasn't able to make it on, tonight. They found me and we kind of found each other at like the perfect time. And it's just been kind of a great relationship. But similar to Myles, like I've been interested in martial arts since I was a kid. I came up in a house that was like pretty political, but sort of definitely, like not, I wouldn't say radical, but political in the sense that like, really, anti-militarism and those sorts of things. So I wasn't allowed to play with guns. And I wasn't allowed to like, like, even like watch TV shows that had like, guns and violence in them. But, martial arts was okay. And similar to Myles, in part because of my dad. My dad was, did Taekwondo, when I was younger. And I remember just kind of being like blown away. Like the first time I watched him like, punch through a block of wood. I was like, oh my God, like the potential is endless. I tried a couple of different things at various points in my life. Like I tried Taekwondo when I was a kid, but I actually didn't really like it very much. And then, when I was in college, there was a Kung Fu, like kind of study group, but all of the Kung Fu students, they were all really, really good, but they were all dancers, like just like their flexibility, their coordination, their dexterity were just things I didn't have. And so I got kind of discouraged, with that pretty early on too. For me, like a lot of my, like actual martial arts training, kind of started, around like, I think it was 2004 when, the Republican National Convention was held in New York and I was working in New York. And so in the job that I worked, sometimes I'd have like a late shift. And there's one particular night that I remember, when, I was walking through, Times Square to get to, the subway. And mind you, by this time I'd also like taken some Aikido classes and stuff like that. And I still hadn't really found what had kind of was looking for, but I had this encounter, when I was walking to the train, cause like the RNC, basically occupied New York. And there were just these like, it was like frankly, some Star Wars shit where you'd be walking down Broadway and there's like this massive phalanx of like 75 cops just lined up, and I'm walking past and, at that point in time, I was like, maybe like, 24, 25, year old, black man. And I was just sort of like, just trying to hold my shit together long enough to get to the subway. And as I finally come to this like seemingly like endless wall of cops, one of them grabs me by my shoulder. And I remember like being like feeling really tense, feeling like really afraid. And he says to me, "Where are you going?" And I shrugged my shoulder out of his grip, and I looked at him over my shoulder and I went home. Cause it was like 11:30 at night. It was just kind of like, fuck off, man. And so as I started to walk off, he started to turn towards me, but like the very last cop at the end of that like line of cops, like stopped him. And I sat like, and I, got in this subway station, got on the train, and the whole time, I'm on the train, I'm thinking about like what would have or could have happened had like there not been like that modicum of restraint. And it was at that point I was like, I need to learn how to do something. And then, my partner, was pregnant with our first, born at that time. And I was also like, I just, I'd never, never had any of those like martial arts power fantasies. You know what I'm saying? Like, I didn't imagine I was going to go out like double jump kicking cops and shit. But I wanted at least to have something and to have some kind of ability to handle myself, just because of like that loss of physical agency at that moment in time was really palpable. And then just particularly just being a black person, in this country, like your physical agency is like, is vulnerable in all sorts of situations. So I kind of started a traditional martial arts route because, again, I wasn't really like, I wasn't trying to like be a badass. I just wanted to know how to handle myself. And then, around like 2013, is when I kind of started, entering into, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and started making that like the main art that I pursued. I moved to Philly in, the summer of 2018. And started training, at a gym, here. And similar to what Myles was talking about, like, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, if you're anything like kind of like left of like, like liberal, you train martial arts, and especially if you train, jujitsu, you're doing some compartmentalizing. Um, and, and I think for me, thinking about like the compartmentalizing that I had to do, like when I went to work every day, wasn't that different, with going to the gym, except that like I felt like I had to do it more and less in the sense of like justifying, like, training with a bunch of people that like that like I could just generally assume we're pretty fucking reactionary. But also just protecting myself and just having to be aware of like, okay, like, I don't like, once it becomes clear that like, that I'm a leftist, radical, that like, that's going to affect both not just my relationships, because my relationships in the gym, like, I always, got along with everyone really well, but like, I was always I never hung out. It was never like my like social scene, which I think happens a lot, especially in jiu-jitsu. Where it was like, I come to class, I train hard, I go home, that's it. But like, but all the things that you have to do, particularly, if you have, if you come from a marginalized background, like, paying attention to people's tattoos. Because you're like, oh, that's a fucking dog whistle right there. This guy might be a literal Nazi. And shit like that. And so, by like 20, by like midway through 2019, I was starting to get like less than comfortable, where I was at. And then, around the end of 2019, I'd sort of decided like to kind of branch out and, and try to check out, some other spots that I thought might have been, a better fit. And that's actually around the time when I found out about, the space that, is like now kind of evolved into the Neighborhood Martial Arts Project. And then, I was like, okay, I'm going to start cross training there. I got my brown belt, in early 2020. And so it's like, okay, trying to figure out like, when I could you make some time to cross train. Cause, I mean, Sam, like when you're a parent, like finding time to do anything is, it's a lot. So, and so like basically like, by the time, while I was still figuring all that out, like, bam, COVID hits, everything is locked down. And similar to, what Myles was saying, and particularly for me, there was like a lot of, for people that I knew at the gym where where I'd been training, fellow students and instructors, there were like some real mask off moments where it was like just on an ethical and moral and like, my deepest beliefs. Not only can I never train with you again, but like, we're enemies. And so basically I ended up leaving that gym and burning like every single bridge, to it, with all the glee I could muster. And then, it's like, God, I think it was like mid-June, and it was just like me in my basement, getting my son to train with me every now and then, and then like, doing some kids, basement jujitsu with my daughter and my niece. And then I get an email from a guy that was, friends with, a friend who'd also left that gym for like a lot of the same reasons. It was like, hey, there's a friend of mine that I think you should meet because I think you have a lot of common. And I realized like, oh, this is actually the same group of people that I was looking to cross train with before everything went down. And we started doing, classes on Zoom, essentially like solo drills, classes. And they, and for me, it was a great way to kind of get started with doing some teaching, which I hadn't really done, which I felt was important to kind of do, as a brown belt. And then like, we, just developed like a really strong friendship. The three of us like doing that together, like week after week after week for like, God, Myles, was that like 8, 9, 10 months? We did that shit for a while.
It kind of slowed down at the end, but I think we hit a 1-year anniversary.
Yeah, no, you're right. We did. And we did it, like, we did that shit for a year, which was like great. And then basically, once we were all vaccinated, we set up like a whole training protocol. And since I had mats in my basement, I was just like, come over, we can train whenever we want. And so we did that for almost another year. And then, it was like around this past spring or summer, we decided to kind of come out of the basement and we wanted to start a community gym.
This is the wholesome basement, not the blue basement full of reactionaries and fascists.
So, and then, we started, talking with a couple of neighborhood, organizations and wanted to put together, a program and we ended up, finding a really, connected with a really great, group, the North Square Community Alliance, shout to them. And we worked out a really good deal, for a really amazing, space. And, that's where we've been.
Now, what is the Neighborhood Martial Arts Project?
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of a few of the founding impetuses for the gym were, for one, kind of going back all the way to 2018, a lot of us kind of started to really become, or like look to disassociate from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA around the rise of Bolsonaro. A lot of like the luminaries of the Jiu-Jitsu world were very vocal about their support for him. And so, and that kind of actually spilled in not as much to my gym, but I know a lot of the other, gyms around the area, especially like that had either the head instructor or some instructors that were Brazilian, we're kind of like bringing that into the gym and kind of talking, pro Bolsonaro talking points in class and stuff. So that, was one thing where it was kind of like, okay, if they can, use this as a platform for their right-wing politics, for one, we don't want to be a part of that, but also, maybe we can kind of do something similar, for our politics. And I do know another big, inspiration for Alejandro in particular, was a gym in Buenos Aires, what was it called? The Cultura del Barrio, I believe. It's basically an anti-fascist gym. They have like boxing and Muay Thai. He went and visited it and was, just very moved and impressed by their program. And one of the biggest things that struck him was, there was a lot of of involvement from the community and the neighborhood, and even people who weren't, fighting and training would stop in, support the gym. He even told us a story about a time that they were like raided by the police and the neighborhood came out to defend them. So that was definitely a huge inspiration. And I know other members, had been to similar, types of gyms, I think in Mexico and Colombia. So there, I'm not sure if it's like a cohesive movement or anything like that, but, there seemed to be, there was a lot of inspiration from, South America and Latin America and, the kind of popular gyms, community type gyms there. So that's definitely a model that, has always inspired us. And that's always been a major focus of ours is, to be focused on building community and not really in kind of like the, um, liberal, very nebulous sense. Like we actually want to help get the community more organized. So there's places for people to go if they have a certain need and ways to connect different organizations within the community. And that's another, kind of area where we're looking to, or we've been able to, kind of, put down roots and establish kind of relationships. Before we actually had another landlord, another organization that we rented from previously that we have a good relationship with still, that we rented for just a few months before we moved into our space here. So yeah, trying to kind of be connection between some of these different places, and a space where members of the community can, work out together, build relationships. And then also, I know especially recently, we've been very inspired by a lot of the things that you're doing with Southpaw, that some kind of comrades in the Southpaw orbit have been involved in trying to kind of counter some of the right wing culture in the martial arts community. So yeah, we're hoping to be kind of, a liberatory space in what is usually otherwise not a very, is typically a very reactionary environment. So I don't know if Jelani, if you have anything to add to that.
One of the things that I think, is important, and Myles kind of touched on this earlier when he was kind of talking about his background a bit, but like thinking about how, politics and physical culture, kind of overlap. And, um, and I think particularly for those of us who are on the left, there's a lot of potential, both in terms of, like organizing, in terms of like strengthening, our communities, like our gym is in a predominantly Black and brown, community. And also for, for autonomy that people often don't feel, again, particularly, if you're marginalized in one way or the other. Martial arts is a really, I would, particularly on the left, is really underutilized tool, both in terms of just like straight up organizing, but also in terms of just, doing something for your community as it exists. And so that's one of the things that I think, is really important and definitely keeps me, motivated with what we're doing is, just what that can offer people. And that's kind of what I think of in terms of being like a liberatory space. It being a space where, you don't have to worry about like, or being cagey about, about your identity and who you are, because, there are people that are going to have, if not a physically violent reaction to it, at least like a socially violent one or a verbally violent one, particularly, if you're gay, or trans, or have to deal with like, people saying, racist Trumpy shit, in the locker room and stuff like, you know what I'm saying? And stuff like that. And being able to create a space where people are able to, they don't have to do that compartmentalizing, where they're able to, train way that they want to be able to train and learn, the arts that they want to learn without having to make any compromises about, who they are and, in what they believe. And so in that respect, like, I think, what the Neighborhood Martial Arts Project, what I think it does at its best is, first of all, like, offer that to people, within our orbit. But also kind of show people that, like, you don't have to train with bigoted assholes to learn martial arts. Like, you don't. And particularly at various points, for all of our experiences in martial arts, like, there were, like, relatively limited places that you could go, but that's just not the reality anymore, and it doesn't have to be. And I think the more that people understand that that not only do alternatives exist, but, like, they can be built and they can be continually built. And if we can put ourselves into those sorts of projects, even if it's just, even if it's just a small training group, we can do a lot to both hopefully, get martial arts culture out of, like, the right wing, like, bog that it's been, trapped in for a very, very, very long time. But also be able to create, like, parallel structures. So not only are you able to sort of, like, escape it, but you can also start the process of starving the beast. And that way, not only do you get something that's liberatory in terms of just, like, your own training experience, you get something liberatory where, like, you can open up martial arts to people that may not have, like, a lot of the things that people need in order to be successful in training with martial arts, like, i.e., like, expendable income, or, like, being able to buy, gis or gloves or, or tie pads or whatever, right? And to be able to remove those barriers, as well, and make it so that martial arts can be, like, a popularly practiced thing that doesn't require you to have, like, started when you were 12 and you've got a private tutor, or, like, your entire life is built around, being the best at this, martial art. And instead, like, like, training for, your own life, in like, your own well-being, training as part of, like, community defense, and community wellness, for communities that already exist. Like, I think one of the most powerful things, like, from talking to folks, around the neighborhood of the gym, and particularly, people who, are from the North Square, Community Alliance, like, having conversations about how, for, like, young people from, like, really, like, late middle school through high school, if you're not an athlete that plays, like, basketball or football or, like, a major sport, there's literally nothing for you. And just that sort of, that void that's kind of left there can be filled by a lot of things, right? And so if it can be filled, by a space that is, that is inclusive, is a space that is, like, fundamentally anti-racist, that is fundamentally, socialist and therefore anti-capitalist, and that, is also about, like, kind of removing, a lot of, like, the really shitty hierarchies that exist in martial arts, then, like, there's a lot that people can gain from that, on a bunch of different levels. And so for me, those things I think are really, really important, in terms of what we're doing, and what also is possible to be done, like, not just by us, but really, by anyone that is on the left and involved in martial arts in some way, shape, or form.
For people listening, like, what area are you in so they can be like, oh, I'm here, I could go there?
NMAP is located in Kensington, so we're up in North Philly. Look us up, check us out.
Okay, in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area.
Yeah. Kensington is one of the things about, like, Kensington is that there is a bit of, like, a kind of, like, regional stigma attached to it. Like, it's the, it's like, it's the rough and, quote unquote, like, dangerous part, of the city. But, these are largely working class, largely, black and brown communities that are systematically neglected. I was looking at a map, like, just the other month about, like, just trash collection in Philly. and dumping in Philly. And this is an area where when developers are doing their like massive gentrification projects, like Kensington is where they illegally dump all of their shit, right? And it's also an area where like garbage pickup isn't as regular as other parts of the city where like, University of Pennsylvania professors tend to live and, and things like that. So that's also an important part of I think, about what we're doing is that it's a neighborhood where, where as a group, there are roots. All hunters lived there for a long time. Myles has lived there for a long time. Again, I'm relatively new to the area, so I don't really count that much. And again, I'm also a new guy. But deciding to set up our gym there, similar to the previous project, was an intentional choice for those very reasons. We've all seen the memes of like how like you can tell your neighborhood is getting gentrified like when it's when there's a Starbucks and like a yoga studio, right? But I think in a lot of ways like expensive martial arts gyms are also that an indicator of that too. And so, and for those same reasons, because those things are not meant for the people that already live there, right? So they're meant for the people that they're trying to attract to those areas. And so having a place, that is meant for the people, who are already there, who are being systematically neglected, I think is also a really important thing.
A note to our listeners. If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, like early releases of Southpaw Deep Space Nine, our fictional narrative podcast, Fighters Brew, break-free versions of our shows without interruptions like you're hearing now, bonus articles, Fighters Brew transcripts with extra content, Liberation Martial Arts Online, as well as our private chat group on Discord. You can also make one-time donations at Ko-Fi or show your solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com. So how does this vision that you two have laid out play into how you run things, teach things, the people you want to attract, and the culture you want to cultivate and have?
I guess one of the big things is, it would definitely be much easier for us to go kind of a commercial model, not in the sense of like, our charging members more and stuff, but more so like, really cast as wide a net as possible, do some advertising, really aggressively look to build membership and kind of like in a, just like almost like if you build it, they will come kind of model. So if we get big enough, then we can compete and, with some of these right wing gyms and start to attract more people. We kind of put our politics more front and center. So our project is kind of guided by our political vision. And so, we are closed membership. We ask people, and also if anybody is looking to drop in, shoot us a message first. So, we do kind of vet people. We are organized as a cooperative. We are a nonprofit, like we've registered as a nonprofit. We're organized as a cooperative. So we have a steering committee, but any, major decisions we put to our membership. Not that we're small enough at this point. We just have like a informal discussion during class, but eventually that's the idea. And so, yeah, and we try to take a step back periodically, to look at things through that like political lens and, make adjustments as we need to. In practice, we also try to, instead of just like saying, this is what you need to learn in jujitsu, we try to kind of tailor everything based on like getting better as a collective. So we're not trying to produce like the best champion. We're really trying to like, grow as a collective. And so, some of the, like we have one member right now who's looking to compete soon. So that's probably going to be one of our big focuses as a group. He's going to be competing. Let's work together to figure out how to like come up with a game plan. And what can I learn from helping him prepare to compete? How can I learn how to help other people, prepare to compete better? So, there's a lot of ways to grow in martial arts that don't involve like, okay, I'm going to learn how to do this better, or, I'm going to learn how to beat more people. You can also, if you're being intentional about it, learn how to be a better partner for people to drill with. You can learn how to be, a better support, outside of the gym to people to help their growth in the gym. Those are some of the kind of the ways that our vision, hopefully, is translated and will be translated into practice.
Yeah, that collective piece is like really important, and it's kind of I think guides our approach to pretty much everything, even down to just like how we run our class sessions. Like for our jujitsu classes, like Myles teaches some, I teach some, we co-teach some, we talk about what we're teaching. Alejandro is among other things he's a certified yoga instructor, so we are we're doing like 15 minutes of yoga flow for our warm-ups when we start. And so like there's kind of something collective to like really everything that we do. And like Myles says, it comes down to how we make decisions in the gym. It's definitely like reflected in the way that we treat health and safety, particularly, with with COVID and, and other stuff, and how like, how we kind of maintain like a basic safety protocol that not only involves like making, people taking like semi-regular, rapid tests, so that way we can, keep each other safe as well as ourselves. But then also, making sure that, that we're actually able to, provide free tests for, people who may not be able to afford one now that like they're not doing that for free anymore. Like, that's something that we take on collectively ourselves to provide. So that way that doesn't become a barrier, and we don't also have to make a choice between like people being able to train and like, and then, being as safe as humanly possible about it. So, so like that collective ethos is like really core to what we do. And it's core not just because like we talk about it, but because it's embedded in, like how we set things up, how we make decisions, how, how we think about things, how, we're pretty constantly, looking for, input from each other, and from, and from our collective as a whole.
Now, what classes are available right now, and what classes do you want to add?
Right now, Myles and I, are two jiu-jitsu instructors. So we've been, running class, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, in the evening. We are looking to add a couple of things. We definitely want to be able to add some community yoga. That's like something that's like really, really important to Alejandro, and to all of us. And that's something that I think would be particularly awesome. We would also very much like to start getting in, start developing a striking program, try to recruit a striking instructor, because that's something that I think would entice probably more people than jujitsu would. Jujitsu does tend to have a more of a niche audience. Yeah, those are the two big things that like that we've been talking about. But there's certainly more.
So then, is NMAP trying to be more than just like a radical BJJ gym, but more of a non-denominational gym as far as activity, like a gym, not just a BJJ gym?
Yeah, I mean, part of it I think is part of that is really draws from the community aspect, because not everyone is going to be interested in jujitsu, and that's fine. And we don't necessarily want everyone to be interested in jujitsu or feel like that's what they have to do. Like, obviously, I think, there's a lot to be, derived from it. There's a lot, to benefit from it. There's a lot of like really cool stuff to learn. But I think it's also important to kind of like meet if you're trying to do something that has like an authentic basis, in a community, you very much want and need to respect, that, that community and kind of, where they're at and like, where their interests and priorities lie. So in that respect, like, having striking classes, I think would be really good because that's also something that we could schedule on days when, like Myles and I can teach Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Like, we're, like I was saying before, like we're not the kind of people that like, have, like tons of expendable income or, have all the free time and we can teach every single day. That's sort of like the maximum, that we can teach. But we also don't want that to be a limitation, for people because, again, there are people that are going to be working Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings. And so we want to make sure we want to be able to make sure that something is available for them too. So, being able to have, classes that appeal to different interests, particularly, people that are more interested in striking than grappling. And then also for people that aren't necessarily interested in, in martial arts, but like, you know, um, would be interested in taking a yoga class a couple times a week. I think that would provide not only benefit, for them, but then also helps to help expand the gym, like as a community space.
So something I've talked about a lot, which is bidirectionality. And it seems like this gym is all about that, where it's not just about you deciding we do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. We're going to thrust that upon the community. It's also listening to what the community wants and trying to meet them and try to offer that as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're speaking to a lot of listeners who are socially conscious. Are you all in need of more volunteers? It's a good chance to talk about things that y'all need.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely would love to have more participants for sure. One big challenge, Jelani alluded to this a little bit, is, we're kind of drawing from like multiple niches at the same time. So, we get a lot of people that will like drop in, especially like leftists throughout the city. But, in terms of like members who are there, let's say every class or most classes, just to be kind of, participants. And so there's more training partners. You really need somebody who gets kind of hooked on jujitsu or whatever, additional activities we're doing. And we do we're in a period right now where, if you're really into jujitsu and you want to be like, competitive and train a lot, 3 days a week might not be enough to keep you happy. So, we're kind of, we need people who, are both committed politically to this kind of project, but also, who it's not a chore for them to show up 3 times a week. Like they really like training. And, so those can be kind of some niches that, there's not a ton of overlap between a lot of times. So yeah, and also, it's not like we expect anyone to train exclusively with us. A lot of our members do train other places. We would love to build into a space where, we could just be like your exclusive gym. You do everything there. But, so yeah, if anybody out there like thinks like, oh, I'd love to check them out, but I could only stop in like once every month or two, that's perfectly fine. We love, we have a lot of visitors. We love that. But yeah, it is definitely a challenge, and anybody else who's looking to start this kind of thing, you do really need to have a good sustainable program. You need like a core group that's very committed, and it's hard to get that if you don't just love like whatever you're doing.
And what about material needs? What are some of the things y'all need money for? And is there a way people can help out online?
We do have a GoFundMe that, we can stick that in like in the description, right, Sam?
Yeah, I'll put that in the show notes.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So we do have an active GoFundMe. There's a couple of needs that like I think about a lot. One thing is that we would love to be able to have a crash pad so we could, like really, work on our judo throws a lot. That's very much me thing. And, and then, we've also are trying to, we also need some to get some materials to finish up, like our kind of lockerish room, space, for people. Cause, we just want to make sure that we have just some of those like not basic, but some of those like facility, needs that we want to, have for people, like have those, as much in place as possible, because the space that we have was pretty much like raw. It was like basically like the footprint basement. And so it's one of those things where it's like, it's fully operational. But there are definitely some things that we want, and need to just to kind of fill the space, and also just to make sure that like all the facilities, all the things that people need, are going to be there in a way that's like, that's comfortable and affirming for everyone.
And we do also have rent to pay every month.
This is also true.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's like running costs as far as cleaning supplies and mending stuff, and like mats need to get replaced every once in a while. So there's a lot of running costs as well. And then also other variables that you don't even know you need money for. And then something happens, something breaks, and you're like, oh, we need money for this too.
Yeah. Like the flood we had, Miles. We had a flood like 8 weeks ago. That was just like a nightmare to deal with.
So there's also a need for a treasury where you just have extra cash just in case. Not everybody's going to check the show notes. So for people who wanted to find that, like let's say they go on GoFundMe, what can they search on there to find your specific GoFundMe?
I think if you just search GoFundMe Neighborhood Martial Arts Project, it should come up.
Now, I remember early on, Jelani and I talked about running a gym completely decentralized and flat, no teachers and no rankings and maybe no structure. And I know Jelani comes from the Black radical tradition, and it was he who said that's too idealistic and not actually a good idea. And then in our old Facebook group, which had a lot of people, especially marginalized people and women, they said making it unstructured and flat would actually be its own form of gatekeeping, because only men who've already trained and feel confident would feel comfortable doing self-study style environment, right? So I've been training since I was born. I almost forget, right, what it feels like to be somebody who doesn't know anything. So how do you all balance that, where you don't want the teachers to become like cult leaders, like we see in commercial gyms, but where you also give power and autonomy to the students and also to the neighborhood? And I know that's an evolving process, but where is NMAP starting from?
For me, because I have a teaching background, and my teaching style, like in a classroom, has always been like project oriented and student led as much as possible, with like really kind of conscientious scaffolding, is something that since that's like my teaching background, like, and as we've talked about a lot, Sam, like the way that you do one thing is kind of the way that you do all things. That definitely like influences the way that, way that I lead class. And I think about it just as that, like, if when I show up to the gym, like I'm not the teacher, I'm leading class that day. And for me, like that's an important kind of like psychological distinction, because there's two things. First, it makes it so that way, like I'm not like so much feeling like I'm in charge or I'm the authority, but that like I'm leading people through something that like I've planned out that's going to give them something. And that what it gives them is less about like me deciding what it gives them, but what it can lead to. So one of the things that I do a lot, is I try to solicit feedback from students that are training, especially if it's something that like is either new to them or something that I'm teaching because like I've noticed it being like, there being a pattern of like difficulty or problems with it. And so for me, like that's a lot of how I kind of try to eliminate like a sort of like a strict hierarchy while it's still being clear that like, okay, this is the person that's leading class and we're, following along with what they're doing, but there's like almost constant opportunities, for feedback and input. Like I might be teaching something and like I forget or like I lose sight of one detail and like Myles chimes in with it. And I'm like, thank you for that, because I would have probably forgotten that otherwise. Or, if, when a student is having difficulty, with a technique and and in helping them, I can figure out why, then that comes back to the whole group and we can say, hey, if you encounter this, this is how to kind of solve that problem. And then, even in just like, after, a period of drilling and, going to, some shorter positional rounds, like seeing how people take what we've practiced, like in our technique portion of class, and like apply it to a situation that is relatively controlled because it's positional sparring, but like free and not like, your opponent can do different things. And you can make adjustments based on what they're doing, and then it becomes live in a way, and then, can solicit feedback that way. And then also as instructors, like, do what good instructors should do, make observations, both in terms of, okay, how are they doing this? A, B, what mistakes am I seeing? And then off of that B question, how much, like, where are those mistakes coming from? Are they coming from like an oversight of something that like I wasn't explicit about that maybe I should have been, or something like that?
It's interesting you asked this because we actually have attempted throughout our history to kind of encourage like people who don't feel like they have the expertise or don't feel like they're instructors to lead classes, and we have never been able to get anyone to do it. I think partially, it might be different if you like start from that kind of model. But especially if you've had kind of, instruction and you have like a structured class, it is like very intimidating for somebody to feel like, okay, now I have to step in and lead this. And we've even suggested like, okay, let's get a little group. And yeah, I totally agree, that it is very intimidating if you don't already have that background. I do think, now that we're kind of talking about this, one thing that kind of stands out to me is there's definitely a kind of a different feel to, I've taught a lot of classes in like a commercial gym. I've taught here. If I'm just teaching the class and kind of dictating, okay, like now we do this, now we do that. I have everything kind of, an agenda for what we're doing. It has a much different feel than even introducing kind of just some variety. So like Alejandro leads the warm-ups, Jelani does a takedown, maybe I teach guard pass or sweep, and then, we all work on some positional sparring and then have a discussion afterwards. I find that encourages, when we have that kind of more dispersed instruction, and more involvement from people, it does feel like it's easier for, other participants to like chime in with, their own questions or even some feedback like, hey, it seems like this reminds me of something we were doing the other day. Could we do this here? So yeah, no, I definitely think, it is hard, especially with like something like, jujitsu that's like can get very technical. If you don't have like guidance in some areas, a lot of times you can just kind of end up either creating and reinforcing bad habits or just wasting a lot of time on, things that, or wasting a lot of energy when, you could just be making small adjustments. So yeah, I definitely agree that there is a place for kind of experience and expertise. But I think it is kind of, that there has to be some kind of balance, and especially in a program like ours, which, that's something that we're always trying to examine, be self-critical and, figure out better ways to do things. So if anybody has suggestions too, we're always open. We're always looking for suggestions on how to be more inclusive and also how to, just, be a better program. So that, always please, if anybody hearing this has any ideas or has something that's worked for them, shoot us a message on Instagram or, get in touch because we'd love to hear about it.
One of the things that I think is really embedded in terms of what we do, like when each of us is running class, is having like a really deep respect for the learner's desire to learn. And I think that's an easy thing, especially in martial arts and especially in, jujitsu and like, in commercial gyms where you do have these hierarchies where if like black belt says so, then like, then like you don't really have a voice. You don't really have a say. Like you don't have any input at all. And I think that like that sort of ethos of, of like, having an authentic respect for someone who's shown up to class, who's taken time, and travel and, and whatever to spend this time on this mat with you. Like I think that respect for, the learner's desire to learn does two things. First, it makes it so like the way that you're teaching becomes less and less about like my expertise and more about like what do they need, what do they want. And then also helps to show that like, you're still a learner too. And that like, that in a lot of ways that like, like as the sort of in kind of like educational parlance, like, a good teacher teaches a student and a good student teaches the teacher. And I think that some of that kind of dynamic, comes out, in our class. Actually, just like the other night, like, one of our students, was like really excited to show me like this catch wrestling move, that he learned that I'd like never seen before. And it was really, really cool. You know what I mean? And so, and I know like, I mean, I've definitely been to gyms where instructors would take umbrage over something as minor as that. You know what I mean? But I think when you have a space and you have an environment and you have a way of relating to people that's about mutuality, you then have these, these kind of dialogues, in from multiple different directions. And like, yes, the people that come to your class, like they should be able to take something away from that class when they walk out of the door that they didn't have before. But also, on a lot of those nights, like I do the same thing too. Like I'm like, like I taught this, this guard pass, or I taught this throw, and like I realized something or I learned something that like I wouldn't have had I not done it with this group of people.
Jelani, you already mentioned how your teaching background informs how you teach martial arts. But what about your writing background and fiction and literature background? How does that inform your views on martial arts and this project?
It's funny. Like, there's the classic Nas line of like, the rap game kind of reminds me of the crack game. And I always feel like, the fight game reminds me of the right game. Both in the obvious senses, like the obvious senses being, they're incredibly difficult long-term skills to learn where quite often you never feel like, oh, I'm very good at this. And also, like not really having much opportunity to make a decent living at either of them, are definitely two of the ones that I think about the most. But I do think about them in similar ways in terms of thinking about, how form and expression, where they meet, and how it's important if I'm going to express something, I need to give it a form. But that form isn't a rigid thing. That form is very much dependent on like what I want to express. And through the process of doing that, of trying to do that, of struggling to do that, arriving at like the form that's going to allow for that expression in the most effective way that like I can as a human being, like as a person. And I think the same thing is true, for martial arts too, where having like a basic sense of structure is important, but not something for you to like rigidly latch onto, but is something to kind of use as guideposts and things that you can shift and move because, well, they're going to shift and move because you're not standing still. Your partner or your opponent is not standing still, and you have to be able to react to things. Some things that you can predict, and some that like you really can't. And then also doing it in such a way that also like leaves room for, for spontaneity, where you intentionally don't answer certain things because like how and why you arrive at a particular answer is actually part of the answer. And so I think about those things a lot. I honestly think about those things more about like my own kind of personal martial arts and like where I am, like, with my jujitsu than like teaching. When I'm teaching, I try to create, a scenario and an environment where people can do that, can do that thing. But when I think about writing, when I think about writing and I think about martial arts, I think about both of them as like, you know, a practitioner who, like wants to just like learn, explore and enjoy it as much as I can for as long as I'm here. And those are the sort of the ways that like I think about it. Like, if, um, so in just our own, training, even just like, on the side or before class or, or after class or whatever, I just like this past summer was like the summer of the Berimbolo for me. So it was like lots and lots of miles an hour doing lots and lots of Berimbolo training. And so for me, like part of that was like obviously like learning like, okay, and like focusing on like, okay, this is the structure of the Berimbolo. This is where this needs to be. This is where that needs to be. But then also thinking about like, okay, based on like, my style and my game, like where are my entries? Where are my entries to the bolo? When my opponent or, or training partner reacts to it and they start defending it, what can I do to be able to like negate that defense? Or if their defense is beating me, like what can I transition to? And those sorts of things. So it's about, practicing and improving my Berimbolo, but not in like this like pure, like kind of stratified technical sense that doesn't exist in a context. But doing it in a way where it's in a context from the beginning, is really how I think about martial arts and learning martial arts a lot. Like that's definitely like very core to how I think about and approach, you know, anything related to martial arts, but particularly like things that I'm not great at, or things that are just new.
If you love the Southpaw Project, become one of our financial supporters. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. We can't exist without your contributions. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at southpawpod.com. Myles, you've done the most martial arts teaching. So what are lessons from your years of training and teaching that you think are still valuable for this project, and also things you always wished you could change?
One of the things that's for me as like a martial artist, I think one of the things that drew me to jujitsu is that there are very flashy moves that are still effective. I'm drawn to like the aesthetic of martial arts. And that's something like, that I kind of embrace and try to impart, is that like, look, it doesn't have to be, just, I want to learn how to like win in a life and death struggle. Like maybe you just want to do something that looks cool and a bunch of people like ooh and ah when they see it from the side of the mat. Yeah, I mean that's kind of like my, my, like how my jujitsu and my martial arts ethos is structured. But yeah, so I think some of the big things for me, is I find a lot of jujitsu instruction, tends to be like very disjointed. Like you just learn random moves. This instructor, like, saw this on YouTube yesterday, they want to teach that. So like really being conscious of, like the I guess curriculum, but also just like the development of individual students and trying to make sure that like everything that you're kind of connecting different things. And I also feel like, one thing that we try to do differently, at least my experience in a lot of jujitsu has kind of been like, okay, you get shown a smattering of moves and it's up to you to kind of like figure out how they connect, come up with your own system of learning. And the few kind of encounters I've had with instructors that have been, a little bit more systematic about it has really, that's when I've kind of progressed the most. But one thing that I've never really encountered is kind of that, like, being systematic about the program as a whole and the training room as a whole. And, kind of going back to like, when you're drilling a move, if I'm drilling a move and my partner just falls the instant I touch their leg, like I don't really get reps there. So, you kind of have to have like everybody, if everybody in the room is on the same level, in terms of like expectations and looking to kind of, if I'm your partner and you're drilling a move on me, I want to be an active partner and try to, give you the best reps that are possible. So, kind of that kind of, I've had mixed experiences, but that's really been the zone in which I've, found the most improvement in myself.
I think one of the things that I think about, like, kind of having a kind of systemized approach, one of the things I think that's really good for, especially in jiu-jitsu, is giving people like context for techniques. So that way, whatever they're learning, like they have like, for lack of a better term, kind of like a sorting method for like where this goes. And then also like what makes it significant or like worth learning, and so that way they can see, how it fits into like jujitsu as a whole. But then also how like gets them to start, I think, thinking about more open-ended questions, which is, okay, like for example, having a sense of how something fits, how a technique fits into jujitsu as a whole is really important. But then having the open-ended question of like, okay, how does this fit into like jujitsu as I use it? I think is also really, really important, both because that answer is almost definitely going to change like as you develop. And it also makes it so the learner is like an integral part of the learning process, as opposed to like, shout out to Freire, as opposed to like that sort of kind of really factory model type of education that is seen a lot in martial arts schools, where like, you learn a technique on one day, you learn a technique the other day, and it's like how sitcoms used to be, where it's like a reset every time. And none of these things, the relationship between any of these things is never established. And so I think that that's also, something that, that we certainly, are striving for in our classes, that we want our students to take, out of any class that they show up to.
I think one of the biggest things, you've already mentioned this, I think we've all maybe mentioned it once, but is really avoiding that, kind of creating idols out of instructors. It is especially, if let's say you're learning a move and you're really struggling with it. And, I'm not saying I can always do this, but I could come over and say like, oh, you know what? You need to put you need to get your hip here and, wedge your knee like this. And then all of a sudden you can pull off this move easily. Or even like just training with your instructor and, they have so much more experience than you that it almost is like, feels like it's like a mystical thing. And I still experience this, when I train with certain people too, but it's very easy for that kind of response psychologically to then start to spill over into like, oh man, this person is an expert on everything. They're a guru. And, I've even, it makes me very uncomfortable. Like I'm teaching a class And, after the class, somebody comes over and like starts asking me for like financial or life advice. And, I'm like, what makes you think I'm qualified to be telling you this? Like, I just taught you how to like flip somebody over your head. That doesn't mean I can tell you how to, balance your checkbook. But yeah, so I do think, you definitely have to, that's something that even in a space like ours, I think there's always that risk when you're, kind of like just by the nature of what we're doing, we have some people who are much more experienced, and it is something we have to constantly wary for, both in terms of like that, instructors don't take that kind of, that kind of position and take advantage of it. But then also, just being vigilant of like, people being overly deferential and like starting to kind of develop a culture of like, let's ask the instructor and,
Yeah, like personal deference.
that's something that I definitely, I even occasionally feel that in our space, in various moments. And it's something that I think, if you're conscious of it, and, just constantly reflect on that and something talk about it openly, it's a little bit easier to combat. But yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think that's just true of martial arts, but really anytime you have some like an expertise, it's easy to kind of allow that to spill over into a lot of other areas that
I'd like for you to actually continue on this thought, because I want to hear some of your experiences as far as like cautionary tales you've learned from commercial gyms that you don't want to replicate or allow in NMAP. And I want Jelani to jump in on this as well, but let's start with you because you're already talking about this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've even seen, like kind of using that instructor position as leverage for like business opportunities. I feel like that's pretty common. But I mean, and obviously, another kind of, hope, obvious example is like, instructors working out with like or developing like romantic relationships with people under them. I know that's like a huge issue, throughout the jiu-jitsu community.
To your point, I think that's a good highlight too. Not just the sexual assault and also grooming and romantic relationships. I think people now are more aware of that, but there's also the other aspect of like money, where sometimes I've seen instructors leverage their position to borrow money from students.
Right.
Or get them to like invest in some business idea. That also happens, that I don't think anybody ever talks about that, but that happens a lot. And then you sometimes get the disgruntled students like, I lent this person a bunch of money, and then the instructor can turn the school against them. It's like, this is a greedy whatever. And that does happen. There is sometimes like a greedy silent partner, but there is also sometimes using that power and authority in other ways, which can also involve money.
Right. And also, I mean, another big thing is kind of, cliques developing within gyms, is another thing that I've seen a lot, where, you have like the competition clique, and, they're the most valuable to the instructor because they're the ones going out and getting the medals and, building publicity for the gym. And then kind of everything gets built around them, and, they can get away with whatever. So I mean, that's kind of related, that kind of like being overawed by certain people, but there's also kind of just like straight up, economic, reasons for that as well. Like, oh, these are our, bringing in the bread. We cater to them. So that's a huge thing I've seen where, people come in that really could benefit from training, really seem to be interested and love it, and just don't ever get that, kind of personal attention or get anyone that makes them feel like, oh, they're actually invested in me learning this and getting better. And then they kind of, either lose interest or, so yeah, that's something that, we try to, constantly be like thinking about, are we including everyone in this? Is this, we even do things like we'll have a class planned and somebody who's never trained before shows up. And so we'll have like a little 2-minute meeting before class. All right, we're going to change what we were going to do. Let's do this instead. So, but yeah, that's another big thing that I've seen is kind of those in-group, out-group dynamics that can develop.
Yeah, I think kind of, echoing what both of you kind of like spoke to is I think, and this is where like, I think like the social aspect of training, and having like a training community, and being like really conscientious about that is really significant um, because similar with like, the money thing and like, like just the really horrible underbelly of, of grooming, sexual violence and so forth. That's, ubiquitous across martial arts, but just, I think the most obvious in jujitsu. Um, I think it's, it's really important to kind of be really constantly aware of like power dynamics and how they are playing out. And I think one of the things that, that I try to do, and I think is something that like, is part of what we do, at the gym is again, to put it back to the community. Um, and to put it back to like the whole group meeting. So it becomes less of, um, this one person has authority vested in them and more about that, like, their authority really comes from the fact that like they're teaching us something. That's where the authority stops and starts. Um, and that authority is fundamentally drawn from from the group, which is a community that essentially is saying like, we are consenting to learn this the way that you are teaching it. And so I think like just being conscious of those dynamics, how they can play out, and then how to offset them. I usually find that like in those, like when Myles was talking about those little moments where it kind of feels like, you're being put a bit on like a pedestal or looked at as like it's like the expert on like, on lots of things, is to kind of shift that back to the whole group. Like if someone is coming to me with like, you know, something that's not related to jujitsu or something that like, that I have some kind of demonstrable expertise in. I mean, the first thing I'm just going to say is I don't know. um, but then I'll also say like, oh, someone else might know about this. Like, hey, does anyone know about like, for example, like resources for X, Y, and Z, or like a good place for this or that? Because like, I'm not a receptacle of like, of like wide swaths of knowledge. Like, I mean, it is even with jujitsu, like I feel like I know a little bit about a little bit. And that the more I learn, the less like I realize like the less I know. Right. Um, and so I think, so I think that like works as like a good sort of like in the moment kind of countermeasure, to, to even just like implicitly get the focus off of like, the person with all the answers to like, oh yeah, this is actually a group. This is a community. And when we need help for things, it's not that we shouldn't ask. It's that like, that there's a community that we have to be able to rely on when we need help, when we have questions, like when we don't know something. And as opposed to attaching to one person that we expect to have all the answers, which they definitely don't have, in which is like the slippery slope of all those sorts of problems that Myles was describing.
So where can people find more information about NMAP?
Well, let's see. I think honestly, the easiest way to kind of just find information and to connect with us in some way is probably our Instagram. Like um, we don't have like a standalone, website. Um, we have, we use our Instagram for a bunch of different things. Definitely some like political messaging, nerding out on martial arts stuff that like, that we're into, that's related to like what we're teaching or stuff that, we're just interested in. Um, but you can, check us out on Instagram. We are at nmap.phl. So if you search that up, you should find us. We also, one of the other things that we do with our social media is, as much as possible, try to like share techniques, or especially like sharing drills that we use, in class. So that way, people who, may not be anywhere near us, have something that they can try to implement in their own training. Or if they're doing something really cool, like, hey, like, I'm not going to deal with these, like, reactionary shitheads at the gym. And, we're going to, me and a group of friends or comrades are going to start our own, kind of training group or study group, to be able to provide like video clips that people can use for their own training, that are, again, less about like, we have all the answers, and more about like, this is a tool that we use to help us with our own training, so that like we can improve, and so that way we can get better, that you can use too.
We also have an email address. It's on nmapphilly@gmail.com. And Jelani and I both monitor that. We're pretty good about getting back to people.
So if somebody is not referred to you from somebody who already knows about the project, the first step then is to contact you through the Instagram or by email.
Yeah, exactly. One of the two, just hit us up and we can have a conversation.
Well, thank you both for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. This has been a great experience, and, it's an awesome conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. You're a huge inspiration for us, so keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, 100%.
And, hopefully this relationship develops further.
Yeah. You got to come to Philly.
I will. If you like this episode and you like what we do, support us on Patreon. We also have the Liberation Martial Arts program if you want to train with us from wherever you are. There's lots of techniques, exercises, theory, pedagogy, and even political theory. You can find Liberation Martial Arts online, also on Patreon. You can find Southpaw merch at our store. You can find all pertinent links on the show notes. With all that said, thanks for listening.
Southpaw.